I watch a lot of Japanese anime, and the stuff I watch is very Japanese. And I don't watch robots and things like that. I'm watching middle school stuff where supposedly he's giving me a really slice of life of what it was like to live in it. And there's one I'm watching, and in it, the girl is completely lacking in any sense of humor. All she wants to do all day long is study. That's it. That's all she wants to do. And then there's this boy, and he's completely strange and whacked out. Now, in the context that they've written it, he is very masculine, and she is very feminine. Is that something that you think because of the way they wrote it, or do you think it's because I'm seeing this because it's in a Japanese context, so it's alien, so I'm accepting them as a given because it's an alien world? And is that something you can take advantage of in a fantastic world? I mean, because she is very clearly a little girl, but all she cares about all day long is studying. No, even more so. Even more so. She doesn't even go to lunch. She just studies. I mean, she is completely mono. Now, part of the storyline is, of course, she's breaking out of this. Otherwise, it would be very boring. But you look at her, and she's a girl. You look at him. He's very whacked out. He does strange things like. Really, what happens in the background is he's very violent at times, but he's kind of a knight in shining armor, but he has no social ramifications. So he just goes and beats the crap out of people to the point where there's a bloody outprint of a human body on the wall after he's done. So they're taking it to extremes. But he also does very strange things, like he'll walk up to people and say non sequiturs to them, things like that. So
you're saying, are you asking whether?
What I'm asking is, because I'm looking at an alien world from my viewpoint, an alien culture, I'm accepting immediately. Is that something that when you're writing a fantasy work, do you have that same freedom, or are you still saying, no, I'm dealing with an American audience, I have to meet certain expectations because I'm dealing with a cultural I'm going to? Or do you think that you could break out and say, I'm going to have a completely strong woman, but it's an alien world, or it's an alien culture, a fantasy world, whatever. Can I get away with that easier than I would in a mainstream book?
I think you can get away with it more easily than you can mainstream, but I think that it's also, as the writer, it's almost completely impossible to shed yourself, your own culture. We swim in our era, in our time, in our culture. It surrounds us like water. We don't even know it. And when we write, you can see this when you look back at old books. If you look at books that were written 50 or 100 years ago, I read The Egyptian by Mikko Waltari. Do you remember that? It was a bestseller in the 50s, and it was about Ramesses II. It was a bestseller. Somehow, although it is set in the pre-dynastic Egypt or whatever it's set out, whatever it was, somehow, even though all the words, all the names, all the events take place in ancient Egypt, somehow it's a very 50s novel. You can feel it. You can just feel it in the reading of it. It is of its era. The author could not escape Dwight D. Eisenhower hanging over ancient Egypt. I'm serious. I don't understand it, and I can't even put my finger on how that was done. But it's obvious that the poor author could not control it, and it was probably could not even see it. Well, we are the same. I'm convinced of it.
I think some really good books don't have that quality, but I think
no,
a lot of books do.
I think that they actually.
When I look back at some of the ones I really like, I think sometimes they do transcend the time they were written to a great degree. But I think in particular, but I think most don't. I mean, I think right.
I think that they may in some aspects, but in many other aspects they are. Because it's impossible to completely shed your period, your time. It comes with your language, with country.
I think you're right to a great degree. And I also think, when I think about books, science fiction, fantasy books that have tried to do something like, I'm going to have a culture that just has women, or anything that's kind of different from the norm, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And sometimes some readers buy into them and think they're great, and other readers go, it's really crazy. And I think part of it has to do with how well, you have a big advantage in anime that you're looking at it. So if she's a cute girl, no matter how she acts, she's still a busty cute girl. And if he's a good-looking guy, In writing, we don't have that. We have other things we can do. If we stop to consider what the complaints might be and try to put even just a line, a hint of why this thing that's not what we would normally think comes to be, Or what can be very effective sometimes is some very bizarre things actually happened once in the past. The past is kind of a strange and wild place. If you can find out that something like this really did happen, and you can have that, if your characters are characters who can say that, if they're aware of human society, sometimes you can get a lot of mileage out of saying this culture is like this one, because the person goes, oh yeah, you're right, that did happen. So they now have to kind of open the door of their thought a little more. And tricks like that, writers can do things that are similar to what you're getting by the visual contrasting with the oddness of the behaviors.
I don't have anything special to add. I was just thinking back to mine.
Well, do we have, before I ask another question, is there someone else who has another question up there before? Okay.
Do you have any particular favorite heroines in science fiction or fantasy that you see?
When I was young, my favorite fantasy science fiction hero was Lessa from Pern.
Oh,
Yeah.
I just finished talking about
Yeah.
that.
We read Dragonflight for our book club.
Yeah, I love that book because it was the first time I found a character anywhere that I thought was somebody, the kind of person I'd like to be. In that she seemed to me tough, but she didn't seem at all overly masculine. She was clever, she was intelligent, she was brave,
And
she
she had a
suffered,
dragon.
she had a dragon. And there was a long time before I found any character that even came close to, even now, I still think she stands out as one of my favorites.
One of my favorites is probably Meg from Wrinkle in Time, and although my favorite of that series was Swiftly Tilting Planet, that's the only book I've ever read in one sitting. Yeah, I guess I liked her sort of nerdiness, and that she wasn't, but she also had a great deal of courage. It was more, mental courage as opposed to physical courage. She wasn't out there like, swashbuckling, but she made things happen and stood up for what she believed in.
I remember particularly that one, she was, had glasses, braces, and she was tall and bulky. She was very unusual. She didn't look, in other words, like Judy Garland. Very unusual. Go ahead.
It's probably not all that politically correct, but one of my favorites as I was growing up was Lucy in the Narnia series. And
Yes.
I loved the way that she took control. I have a lot of problems now looking back at the series with Susan being excluded because she puts on lipstick, but I loved Lucy's spirit and her sense of adventure and her willingness to follow the rules but still get things done and change the story.
I think that, I was thinking when we were talking about this, this topic, this panel, Cordelia Borkosian is a classic, and of course, she's particularly admirable because so many novels, so many stories revolve around the young person achieving adulthood or finding love or finding their career and stuff, and she was one of the ones where she went that next step. You're talking about difficulties of parenthood, of being a good parent. In other words, there's the next life stage, which